So an organic farmer will keep adding organic matter to their soil, but a chemical farmer doesn't keep adding organic matter to the soil, so eventually that organic matter kind of starts to deteriorate and break down and is no longer a great place for microbes to live. So not only does the organic matter start to break down, when the microbes start to die, they're sticking all that soil together with their excrement, and so that starts to break down, so the soil structure starts to break down, and then the least little bit of wind or rain carries the soil away. So as we were driving, like where the retreat center was about, maybe 10 kilometers out of Kanakakai, which is the biggest city on Molokai. And when we were driving in the morning to pick up supplies or whatever we needed to do, or for a day off to kind of hang out with the locals or whatever, you'd be driving along, and if it was a windy day, you couldn't even see the car in front of you. Because if it was windy, the soil was just in the air. There was so much, it was like the dust storms that you read about in the 30s. Because the soil structure has been absolutely destroyed there. And so, yeah, it was all blowing, and then it clogs up the whole coral reef thing, because it blows into the ocean and it settles in the ocean, and so all the clam beds and abalone beds and all that sort of thing were dying because of all the soil that was blowing. That was not only just soil, but it was toxic. And then people are breathing this stuff, and it's full of Roundup, and it's full of other pesticides. So there was a very strong native-led movement, Native Hawaiian-led movement to get Monsanto out of there. But, it's the biggest employer on Molokai. So, 70-something% of the people that have jobs on Molokai work for Monsanto. I have a shirt that I got at a secondhand store. It was the Monsanto Safety Committee. I just thought it was such an oxymoron, I had to buy it. I'll wear it someday. So, the whole role of microbes is to stick all these things together. We'll talk about the different types of soil particles and that. And it's important to have microbes because they stick all those things together. And the way nature builds soil is by feeding microbes. That's the way it builds soil. So year after year, what happens is that, really what some people say is it all started with mushrooms, because when there were huge volcanic explosions, and the air was so full of smoke and so full of particulate matter that plants couldn't actually live, but mushrooms still could live. And so mushrooms started to use any nutrient possible to just kind of, any source of carbon will, the mushrooms can thrive on. They don't need to photosynthesize. And then as they died, more organic matter came along, and but the forest lives because the whole surface litter, leaves, branches, animal scat, old insect bodies, mushrooms, they're all just fall to the surface of the soil, and then the microbes that are in there break it down into soil. And so there's a top layer of humus, and that's mostly organic, and it sounds like yours at the farm is very thick. And then there's the subsoil underneath, and this is sand, clay, sand, silt, and clay. And then below that is the parent rock material. Now, not every place are these layers the same size. Some places they're thinner, some places they're thicker. But generally, most of the life occurs in the very top of the soil. So if your soil dries out, you're compromising this microbial action that will continue to break down organic matter. And if you don't have organic matter, of course, the things that eat organic matter are going to die. So if there's no organic matter in your soil, the surface of your soil, the microbes are going to
the
die.
headings on those bottom 2 layers.
This one?
Yeah.
Subsoil is crumbling rock, sand, silt, and clay.
And what's below it, sorry?
And what's that?
Yeah, what's that one? Sorry?
That's parent material. So that's the actual bedrock underneath the soil layers.
And that's where a lot of the minerals come from.
Yeah, a lot of the minerals come from both of these, actually. So microbes build soil in a lot of different ways. Microbes eat other microbes and then excrete. Living things eat, living things excrete. So the bigger microbe eats the smaller microbe, and sometimes vice versa in the microbial world. And the excess nutrients, just like all of our excess nutrients, get excreted, and then they're available for the plants to use in a really soluble, quite nicely available form. Plants and plant parts die and become organic matter, but they couldn't become organic matter if there weren't decomposing microbes. So the decomposing microbes turn plant bodies and also insect bodies that fall to the ground. Or, I mean, quite frankly, even if I died in the middle of the woods, the microbes would turn me into compost, you know, after all the other animals took a round out of me, right? I mean, that's just the way life works, right? Nature recycles. Some microbes actually wrap around rocks and extract the nutrients and help turn the rocks into soil, as well as feeding plants and helping them make organic matter. And we talked a little bit about the mycorrhizae and how they can wrap around rocks and actually dissolve rocks. And plants themselves can also dissolve rocks. We talked about the carbonic acid. I mean, carbonic acid is the same thing. Did we talk about carbonic acid? Yeah, it's part of photosynthesis and respiration, right? And carbonic acid is the same thing that's in acid rain. So we have some very visible above ground examples of wearing away rock. So microbes build places and spaces to live in the soil that store food, water, and air. So they actually stick the soil particles together very loosely so that there's some air in there. And then as they excrete things, they kind of keep enriching the soil. When they die in that little space, they enrich the soil. They also water is stored in those little spaces because water sticks to soil particles. So because of the adhesive qualities of water, it sticks to the soil particles. So there's air, water, and food in those little things. So there's lots of different job descriptions for microbes. Different microbes have different job descriptions. So these are the microbes in the soils workshop, breaking down manures and organic matter to release nutrients. So this guy is pounding away on the nutrients with his little sledgehammer, or her. And then this guy is eating disease-causing microbes. So that's another job description that certain groups of microbes have, is to eat disease-causing organisms. These microbes are the nitrogen-fixing microbes, and we talked a little bit about those, and they're taking the soil, sees how important it is for soil to have air, because if soil has air also, there's nitrogen in that air, and the plant builds these little nodules to house these nitrogen-fixing bacteria. So these guys here, they're taking that nitrogen out of the air that's in the soil, and they're converting it to a form that the plant can use. So nitrogen actually goes through 2 different stages, and we watched a little film on the nitrogen cycle. It goes through 2 different forms before the plant can actually consume it, and the nitrogen-fixing bacteria are responsible for one of those stages, making nutrients available to the plant. Remember we talked about how the plant can send out exudates and exchange food with microbes like the mycorrhizae, and mycorrhizae gathers food and nutrients from really far from the plant and brings it right to the plant's roots. Some microbes make vitamins and minerals. Sometimes what they do is they extract them from decaying matter. Sometimes they actually just produce them in their bodies. And microorganisms die to become nutrients and minerals in the soil, so dead microbes are a thing. You have to remember that microbes multiply very quickly. Some microbes only live for a half hour, and so within that half hour they have to reproduce, because every living thing reproduces or else the species dies out. And so if a microbe reproduces in a half hour, in less than a half hour, there's more microbes produced in 2 days than humans that have ever lived on the planet. And remember, there's thousands of them in a tablespoon of soil. So that's a lot of microbe bodies. And sure, it's on a microscopic level, but it adds up very quickly. It adds up exponentially. That's the thing, right?
They were here first.
Yeah, they were here first, and they'll be here last. And then there's microbes that actually eat nematodes, and there are some beneficial nematodes, but there are also some nematodes that create that root knot. There's a root knot nematode that creates a lot of problems in the roots, and there are some microbes that eat it. Basically, there are microbes that eat every plant disease. There's no plant disease that there are no microbes that eat it. Otherwise, that plant disease would be rampant in the world. It'd probably take over all kinds of different species and, spread, but there's something that eats it. And so if you have a good diversity of microbes in your soil, you have all these job descriptions. So there's a willing workforce there that is absolutely willing to work for you as long as you feed them your waste material and make sure they have water. Like, that's pretty undemanding. And all the creatures that live in the soil also have a specific job description. So there's all these different guys in your soil that live in your soil, can live in your soil at one time or another. Like people, sometimes they'll open their compost bin and they'll go, oh, there were maggots in it. Well, yeah, but maggots help break things down, and it's okay. It's okay to have maggots in your compost. They will break things down, and then they will die when the type of food that they like to eat is gone, and something will eat their bodies. More microbes will eat their bodies, or they might even manage to hatch out into flies, but still something is going to eat them eventually, whether it be the birds or whatever. So all these creatures that live in the ground, there's a whole pile of them. Little pseudoscorpion, I don't know what he does. I do know that the ground beetle eats slug eggs.
Oh.
So he's a good guy to have.
Quit feeding them to my chickens.
Yeah. Well, there's two different beetles that look very similar. And so it's good to know the ground beetle from the root weevil, because they both look very similar. The ground beetle has sort of ridges on its shell, and it also has these big mandibles up front like this. And the root weevil doesn't have that. So watch really carefully, because these guys eat slug eggs.
Do they have different colors?
No, they're both black and kind of shiny.
Shiny.
Some of them are kind of iridescent. They shine blue, green, kind of like an oil slick,
Yeah.
Kind of shiny with different colors.
So it could either be a ground beetle or a root
A root weevil.
weevil.
Yeah, root weevil is smooth, doesn't have the mandibles. So feed the root weevils to your chickens, but don't feed the ground beetle.
Okay.
Because the ground beetle eats slugs. Mites are another thing, and sometimes my compost, or my worm compost gets these little mites, little tiny mites crawling all over it, but they also are just part of the cycle. And then there's fungi, even slugs and snails have a place in breaking down organic matter. And there's something else that eats them, like the ground beetle eats them, snakes eat them. So if you have, some people will build snake houses in the corner of their garden to house snakes. Snakes like living in like cave-like things. You can build it just out of rocks. And they'll come out and they'll sun themselves on the rocks and stuff. And if you encourage them to come and live in your garden, then they also will eat slug eggs. Yeah, yeah. And the thing is, some mycorrhizae only have associations with some plants and not others. But again, it's the biodiversity, right? What will happen is the ones that are best suited to that area will grow and survive, and they'll consume the other ones. So by introducing a big diversity to start with, then what happens is that, you know, the ones that are best suited to your conditions, the plants you're growing, all that sort of thing, are the ones that are going to survive. So it doesn't hurt to keep re-inoculating your soil with microbes, because you might be growing different things and the conditions might change and all that sort of thing. But certainly, you know, the organisms from a forest that survived on Vancouver Island for, you know, hundreds, thousands of years, those microbes are probably pretty adapted to the climate, at least, and the ups and downs of the climate. So by introducing them, reintroducing them into your soil, because let's face it, if you know, clear a forest to, say, build this campus, probably a lot of microbes are gone. You know, they've excavated and brought in topsoil and, you know, just completely destroyed their communities. So by re-inoculating, you have a chance of reestablishing those very resilient microbes.
Yeah.
So everything has a role in really killing anything, even, you know, the, you know, some of the beetles that eat our plants, you know, sort of breaks the chain. So,
Where are those little potato bugs, sow bug things?
millipede,
No, right. Yeah.
sow bug,
Yeah, what do those things eat? What?
my strawberries.
Those are those little pill beetles. They kind
Yeah,
of
pill bugs,
Yeah.
sow bugs, roly-polies,
Yeah,
they call them
yeah.
a bunch of
They
stuff.
take up heavy metals, don't they, from the soil?
They do take up heavy metals, and the question is, where do they go? But some scientists have said that they actually lock them up in salts inside their body and make them completely unavailable. They just lock them up. So even after their bodies decompose, they're locked up in a compound that makes them not dangerous.
Wow. We need
So,
them.
yeah, so they have a useful kind of thing. They eat cellulose. They eat a lot of cellulose.
So they're not like a termite, they're not gonna eat your wood structure.
No, they'll only eat it if it's already starting to rot. They can't digest, like termites. What termites do, I believe, and also carpenter ants, is they spit something out on the wood to make it rot and then eat it, right? Whereas the sow bugs only are the cleanup crew.
Oh,
You know, once it's rotting, they just turn it into organic matter. So it's a little bit different. So yeah, so all these guys have something to do, and even the microscopic guys, those roundworms, protozoa, bacteria, all kinds of fungi, actinomycetes. You know, there's all this stuff going on all the time. And we're going to take a closer look at some of this stuff. The soil food web, the web of life shares food with each other as well as with us, and any break in the chain is going to compromise one of these lines of processes. So the spider, you know, here the organic matter, bacteria breaks it down, And then the secondary consumers, the primary consumers are microscopic, the fungi and the bacteria. And then the secondary consumers eat the primary consumers. So once you start getting mites and nematodes and springtails and protozoa you can't see, but you can see springtails and mites. Probably can't see most nematodes. But these guys, once you see these guys in here, you know that the bacteria and fungi have finished their work. And then these guys move in. And then the higher level consumers like the ants, the spiders, the centipedes, the millipedes, the ground beetles, and the earthworms move in, and they eat these guys. So once you have worms in your compost, it's already gone through all this process. And then they say your compost is actually completely ready when the worms move on. So, and there's the ground beetle again there. So the gardener's role is to protect the microbes. That's really our primary role, is to protect and feed and nurture the microbes in our soil. And there's these great electron microscope views of, I love the colors that they managed to put in here. These are the Lactobacillus bacteria. I'm not sure, I'm not sure what some of these others are actually, but that's the diversity of life in the soil. And so microbes are invisible invaders and amazing allies to the gardener. Microbes make up 80% of the Earth's total biomass. So they're here to stay. Bacteria has been found living in the bottom of the seafloor, probably as old as the sediment around them, 100 million years old. 111 million years old. 10% of the cells in your body are human, the rest are microbes. So basically they are the majority. So there's lots of different kinds of microbes. I make no apologies for putting microorganisms on a pedestal above all other living things. For if the last blue whale choked to death on the last panda, it would be disastrous, but not the end of the world. But if we accidentally poison the last two species of ammonia oxidizers, and those are the ones that the nitrogen-fixing bacteria are part of that group, that would be another matter. It could be happening right now and we wouldn't even know. So that would be the end of the world if we killed the last two microbes that were responsible for nitrogen fixation. So here's the nitrogen fixing bacteria, a little bit closer view. You can see this bacteria is here. Rhizobium is the genus name for them, and they're in organic matter to begin with. But what happens when they come in contact with the roots is they actually infect the roots. And the infection in this case is a beneficial one for both the plant and the microbe, because then the infection, of course, causes cells to proliferate around it, but those cells actually protect the nitrogen-fixing bacteria, and then the nitrogen-fixing bacteria. So basically the plant is housing the nitrogen-fixing bacteria and feeding it water and feeding it carbohydrates, already manufactured carbohydrates. In return, the nitrogen-fixing bacteria that are living in here are grabbing the nitrogen from the air and feeding it to the plant so that the plant can do all its energy processes and make proteins. So nitrogen-fixing bacteria pull nitrogen from the air, and they trade that nitrogen for carbohydrates that the plant manufactures through photosynthesis. So if these guys died, there would be no more plants. There are phototrophic bacteria as well. So there are one group of bacteria that can photosynthesize, called the phototrophic bacteria. So they can photosynthesize, and they can share their food with the plant. So if we have a plant's leaf, we can actually have phototrophic bacteria living on the leaf. They can manufacture carbohydrates, and remember we talked a bit about endocytosis, how the plant cell can indent and suck in a carbohydrate and then wrap around it and absorb it. So Lactobacillus, that's another thing that we are going to actually add to our soil, and we are going to brew some EM in this classroom.
Whoa.
So, and we'll all have a little bottle of it that we are responsible for. So, yeah, so you can brew some EM.
I still haven't seen it for sale anywhere.
I just picked some up at, well, I picked up some activated stuff already in Buckerfields the other day. But I wrote to I went on the website and the Organic Gardener's Pantry and ordered some mother culture so that we could culture it. So, and that's the Lactobacillus. And Lactobacillus is in all good soils all over the world. And so, if they haven't been too damaged. And so we will introduce some of this Lactobacillus, and its job is to break down food into more easily absorbable particles, just like the Lactobacillus in our guts. And Lactobacillus also consumes disease organisms, so that's a great thing, right? And so we want to keep our soil healthy for these,
Coming in
for
New Zealand.
the Lactobacillus.
Morning, Matt.
So
Nicola.
this is E. coli.
Sienna, is that right? New Hampshire. Beautiful. Good morning, Nicola.
E. coli is
Hi, are you?
one example of an anaerobic bacteria that causes disease in humans, right? And how it causes problems, disease problems, is that it's like that loud, obnoxious person that you wish you hadn't invited to your party. It monopolizes the communication, jams the communication for all the other microbes. And actually, microbes depend on communication for their life and for coexisting within an environment. They actually do communicate. Microbes do communicate with each other. And E. coli jams the communication so that microbes can't function. And so the system breaks down and disease sets in. So anaerobic bacteria cannot live in the presence of air. So once you've expose these guys to air, they die. So that's why you need air in your soil. That's why you need to aerate your compost, is because these guys, and Salmonella is another anaerobic bacteria. So you want to make sure there's plenty of air in your soil, plenty of air in your compost, because you don't want these guys to take over. This old protozoa grazes on the smaller species of bacteria, and the protozoa can't use all the nitrogen it consumes, so it shares the excess with plants. So just another example of all these little critters. Slime mold, this is a close-up of it. It doesn't look this attractive, actually, from far. It just looks kind of foamy and weird, right? And it actually looks quite gross, but, you know, it decomposes wood. So, and all kinds of cellulose, and so it recycles nutrients. So all of these things that might actually kind of gross us out are actually really helpful. And, you know, because they decompose organic matter. Here's a close-up of how the mycorrhizae fungi work. And so there's this little mycorrhizae fungi spore, and it's germinated because there's all these little exudates coming out of the plant, so food coming out of the plant, just like sweat comes off us and skin cells and stuff. And so when it comes in contact with that little spore germinates. And when that spore germinates, it grows one leg right into the plant, and the other leg goes out into the environment to gather water and nutrients. And so this leg gathers water and nutrients and brings it, and in this case, delivers it right into the plant tissues.
That is so cool.
So why is this important? Because these legs can stretch 200 miles.
Wow.
That's the biggest one they've ever found. It's 200 miles long. The DNA was the same on one end of the forest as the other when they checked the DNA of the mycorrhizae. The forest in Oregon that Paul Stamens was doing some work on. And if we rototill,
Yeah,
what do we do?
break it all up.
Break up that whole network. So every new plant that we introduce into the ecosystem, you know, sure, you're, say, digging a hole or planting a seed or whatever, and when it grows roots, this mycorrhizae will attach to its roots.
How deep down is that mycorrhizae?
It can be just below the surface of the organic matter. So sometimes if you're in a forest and you kind of disturb a piece of wood, if you turn over a piece of wood, there's all this white stuff. Now you can't see a single strand of mycorrhizae, but what you can see is bundles. So what you're seeing is not a single strand. It might look like it's as wide as a thread and no wider, but actually that's hundreds of strands. It's almost like molecules of water. We couldn't see a single molecule of water, but what we can see is a group of molecules of water that turn into a drop. And it's the same kind of thing. So you'll quite often see it if you turn over wood, because mycorrhizae really like that moist environment under the wood, and they will also eat away at the wood.
But it also goes deeper?
It also can go deeper, but it probably won't go below
It needs oxygen, right?
10 inches or something like that. What's that?
Like it needs oxygen, right? So it can. It wouldn't be 30 feet down.
I'm not sure if it absolutely needs oxygen or not. That's a good question.
I guess they just found bacteria growing in lava now, so.
Yeah, that's bacteria.
Yeah.
Bacteria tend to have a wider range of possibilities.
Yeah.
You know,
Bacteria.
Not now. Now they're just like, life is everywhere. They
Yeah.
just didn't have the tool to measure in lava.
Well, there's special bacteria that grow where there's vents where hydrogen sulfide is being excreted, and there's bacteria
Super
that
poison.
grow there.
Yeah.
I mean, that's one of the harshest environments in the world. Probably lava's right up there too.
Those undersea vents or whatever.
So I was asking about that because we have the machine at the farm that just, it doesn't till the soil. Harrow? Yeah, the harrower, it just turns it. But I'm like, well, if it's all on the surface, in that depth of those little tongs.
I'm sure it still gets disturbed, but it doesn't get destroyed like tilling gets destroyed. Tilling actually chews it up, whereas a harrow just kind of.
Yeah, this one it turns, and so it does this to the soil. It doesn't do any of that
It's a
at all.
plow.
Yeah.
It keeps the layers
So
all
it's-
intact. Is the
Yeah,
point of
it
that
keeps the
one.
top layer at the top.
Yeah. So I'm not sure. I'll have to ask, but certainly it is disturbing it, and the better way to do it is just keep covering the soil with mulch.
Oh, okay.
And then when you go to plant, what you do is you just sort of push the soil aside and then plant, and then when your plants come up, you push the mulch back. So that's the better way to do it. It's hard to do it on a big scale. It's harder to do on a big scale because you need so much material to mulch. But it still is the ideal way to grow things, is to not to disturb the soil.
Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, you just gotta do what you gotta do, you know?
At the end of the day, you gotta do what you gotta do. And that will, it will reestablish. If you have lots of organic matter, those mycorrhizal threads will grow and reestablish. So, fungi can break down and transport nutrient building blocks. Only plants and some bacteria can manufacture carbs. So what the fungi does is it gathers the water and nutrients and it trades for carbs because it can't manufacture carbs. Only plants and phototrophic bacteria can manufacture carbs, which everything else on the planet depends on for food in one form or another. So there's all kinds of, fungi form these threads, right? And in this case, the fungi is actually strangling a plant predator nematode. So this is, it's growing around this nematode, strangling it and extracting its nutrients. So say if you have a root knot nematode problem, what you want is to build up this kind of fungi in your soil, fungi, who will kill the nematodes for you, right? No pesticides required. And if you have a good balance in your soil, of course, remember the whole fungi, there's spores in the air all over the place, and whether they grow and multiply is whether they have food or not. So if you have these nematodes in your soil, that's why sometimes farmers let their field go fallow, because it gives it a chance to restore the natural balance of microbes, and if there's some disease or something in your soil, those microbes are going to accumulate in your soil that will eat the disease, and maybe not completely get rid of the disease organisms, but bring them down into balance again. That's all you're looking for. You're not looking for ultimate destruction, you're looking for balance, so that you can still grow things in there without the nematodes being the dominant population. So the microbes are exhausted. So these particular fungi are thriving on a particle of biochar, and we talked a little bit about biochar, right, and how it holds water, so that's a good microbial environment. It holds water and air. It's a good microbial environment because it holds nutrients as well. It's got a high cation exchange capacity, so it holds onto nutrients. And so by including biochar in our soils, we provide this great microbial environment.
Your microbiology person that you were saying was Elaine Ingham? Is that
Yeah.
Oh, so one of her diagrams is in this book right here.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. Yeah, she's the soil food web guru. Yeah, she's my hero. So nematodes, these are beneficial nematodes, and they eat, this particular one is eating disease bacteria, and you can see actually inside its body all this bacteria that it's consumed. So if you get these good nematodes in your soil, and again, they just want organic matter, and then, they'll eat disease organisms. And this bottom nematode, these are all young nematodes. And remember I told you there was the ground beetle and the root weevil? The root weevil takes big chunks out of leaves, the larva of the beetle. The beetle lays its eggs in the base of the plant, and then the root weevil larva climbs up and takes big bites out of the leaf. So you'll learn in insect ID that there's sucking insects and there's chewing insects. So you can eliminate a whole category of insects of what is eating your plant just by identifying whether the damage is from a sucking insect or a chewing insect. And so this is the root weevil larva that during the night will climb up your plant and take big chunks out of your leaves. But these little nematodes are actually eating this root weevil larva. And so, and they're laying their eggs in it so that the eggs hatch in there, and when they're babies.
Oh, that's
Yeah,
so nice.
yeah.
Oh.
So, and you can actually buy these nematodes. You can actually buy these root weevil nematodes that eat root weevil. And it's the strangest thing. Maybe the carrier has changed over the years. I haven't had to use them in a really long time, but once I did, when I did, it would come on like a screen, and it just looked like a muddy screen. That's exactly what it looked like. And you soaked it in water, and when you soaked it in water, these little nematodes, like they can insist themselves and they can stay in dry soil for many, many, many years. And then when they get water on them, they'll hatch. And then they go into your soil and they will do this to the root weevil larva. So there's thousands and thousands of them on this screen. They're in encysted form, hanging out there. I mean, in healthy soil, they exist anyway. But it's only when your soil has become unbalanced that you don't have all these things in here, and that's when you get root weevil damage. So by reintroducing them, and they're, you know, it's not like you're introducing a creature that doesn't live there anyway. In good soils, like if you went into the forest, you'd probably get some of them in the soil, but just in disturbed soils, they don't always live. So there's a group of amoebas too, and these are called the Vampyrellids. And the Vampyrellids will actually inject their mouth part or their, you know, piece of themselves, not even a mouth part, amoeba don't have a mouth part. But what happens is they pierce this fungi, which causes take-all disease of wheat, and they just basically suck the life out of the diseased fungi. They just suck all the juice out of them. So there's all these creatures, and I think, you know, do you need to remember all their names? No. I just want to really impress on you how many different creatures are in the soil, how extensive their help can be to us if we maintain organic matter and water in the soil and don't poison them with stuff. You know, that's all. That's this whole thing is just impressing that. And then this fungi, of course, once it's sucked dry, it turns into food for other microbes, and then the other microbes feed your plant. Ciliates are among the largest of the protozoa. They swim. These little hairs here, they go like this. And hopefully we'll get Deborah here to, with her, you know, I've got 4 microscopes. Deborah hasn't responded yet, but sometimes she's pretty busy, so sometimes she's out of town. But I'm hoping we can get her here with my microscopes and you can actually see some of these guys. So they move, and this is a quote from Dr. Elaine Ingham again. Ciliates are the largest of the protozoa and the least numerous. They consume up to 10,000 bacteria a day and release available plant nitrogen. Ciliates use the fine cilia along their body like oars to move rapidly through the soil. So if the soil is moist, remember, it doesn't have to be soaking wet because these guys are so small that there can be, you know, hundreds of them in one single drop of water, thousands maybe even in one single drop of water. So what are all these microbes, what do they need from us? Food, moisture, air. This is actually a picture of a kitchen sponge.
Gross.
Yeah.
This is making my life so hard.
Well, when you think
No,
of
it's so
it, it is
depressing.
the ideal environment because it's got a place for microbes to attach to, and it's got water, and it's got air. Now, my kitchen sponge dries out on the regular.
Yeah, mine too.
So, and that's you know, that's the thing with a dish rag or a kitchen sponge, let the thing dry out. Don't keep it moist because once it dries out, well then, you know, a lot of these guys will die off because it's dry and hard and they have no moisture. Living things need moisture.
Oh my.
So there's all kinds of things on here. There's fungi, there's bacteria, there's ciliates, there's all kinds of things on here. And so the balance of water, of air, moisture, and food particles on a dirty sponge make it a perfect environment for microorganisms to grow.
Yeah, I've already
The surface green in this is bacteria, or the sponge surface is green, sorry. The bacteria is rod shaped, so it's these guys that are kind of in here. Filamentous fungi is thick and the thick filament's pink and purple, so this is the fungi. And yeast fungi, so the yeast are the yellow spheres.
It looks really pretty to understand.
Yeah.
Colors
As
together.
long as you don't know what it is, right? But I mean, and some of these bacteria, like that bacteria could be Lactobacillus that's eating the dangerous bacteria. See, right away, we all assume that this is all bad bacteria. This is all bad microbes, right? We're all assuming that immediately. And that is so symptomatic of our society, where, you know, we use hand sanitizer. Here we go. You know, at every move, because microbes are bad.
You're killing off all the good bacteria.
So, you know, so we don't really know if these bacteria are actually good bacteria or bad bacteria, but we have assumed, because of our cultural bias, that they are not good bacteria, and everyone goes, ew, right? I mean, right? That's just a natural reaction. So we have to kind of, if the sponge smells, yeah, then it probably is bad bacteria, because that means the sponge has stayed too wet for too long, or the sponge, you know, there's different ways to make a sponge, where some sponges have bigger air holes than others. Those are actually they'll keep the sponge aerobic rather than anaerobic. There's other sponges that have just the very tiny holes in them, and those are the sponges that will tend to go anaerobic. So you'll actually have a longer lasting and healthier sponge if you get the sponge with the big holes rather than the small holes. So how do we provide the microbes with what they need? What do they eat? Organic matter, compost pile, animal manure, kitchen scraps, green plant material, dry plant material, husks, wood, straw, all that kind of stuff. Most of this can be waste material. And so there's a couple of different ways of feeding your microbes: compost and cover crops. Mulch and chop and drop the weeds. Chop and dropping weeds is the best mulch, because often the weeds are key to repair nutritional deficiencies in the soil, because Mother Nature does that. And so chopping and dropping your weeds allows those nutrients to go back into the soil exactly where they're needed. So, of course, compost is the backbone of any soil building routine. And you're not after just the nutrients in the compost, you're after those microbes that will grow and thrive in the compost. The best compost is made of a diversity of materials. So yeah, there's compost here that is made of, say, fish scraps and wood. That's not going to be as good as the compost that, say, we can make if we get 1 bag of sheep manure, 1 bag of horse manure, 1 bag of cow manure, 1 bag of chicken manure, 1 bag of rabbit manure, 1 bag of alpaca manure.
1 bag of mushroom manure, whatever they call it.
Mushroom manure is full of toxins. Taking a step back, manure is already degraded plant material, because the animals eat plants. They extract most of the nutrients. Manure is not a great material for nutrients. It's a great material because of the microbes in it. It's a great material because it fosters microbial growth. But it's not a great material. If you look at the NPK of most manures, it's actually quite low to begin with. So you get all these different kinds of manures, and then the other thing to do, you want a diversity of microbes, so you want a diversity of materials. So every animal has different microbes in its guts, responsible for the breakdown depending on what it eats, depending on where it is. So the more different manures, the better. And then the more different kinds of materials, the better. So instead of just having wood chips with this manure, you want wood chips, you want food scraps, you want paper, you want coffee grounds, you want hair from the hairdresser, you want whatever you can think of, fish scraps, you want. The more materials, the more different materials you have, the more different kinds of microbes you're going to have. And then let them battle it out. Let them decide, you know, what's the best suited for your conditions and the plants that you're growing. Because they will. If they're not being fed by the plants that you're growing, they'll die off. If they're not being fed because there's no disease organisms in your soil, well then that population kind of wanes, right? And might go, in some cases they just go dormant, in some cases they just die off. But let them fight it out. Let the survival of whatever best suits your soil, whether it's wet or dry, whether it's hot in Port Alberni or cooler in Euclula, the microbes will sort it out.
What about things like, I don't drink, but sometimes people give me beer. Can you just pour the beer in the compost? Like, is there any like yeast or type stuff that?
Well, alcohol kind of kills microbes.
Mm-hmm.
That's a bad idea.
Mm,
I just
you
didn't
might
know-
have to use it for weed killer.
Well, I didn't know if like the yeast and all the stuff that's in there would have.
The yeast is probably good.
Have a different
And
kind
people
of-
use spent hops for things, but that's before there's a lot of alcohol developing. So that's another really good source of nutrients is spent hops that they use
Like from these breweries around
from
town?
the breweries.
Microbreweries.
Yeah.
So as of this year, I know, I looked into the proposal that Dog Mountain Brewing had provided to the city of Port Alberni, and one of the things they had on their proposed rezoning application was all of their spent yeast, I guess, from the brewing process.
The yeast in the hops.
Yeah, isn't going to the landfill, it's actually gonna be picked up by Earthland and Sea and added to their compost now.
Right, that's the company here,
Yeah.
Earthland and Sea. Yeah.
So, and they're the ones that currently have the shitty soil, they've got fish
Yeah.
heads and wood chips.
Yeah.
Cedar chips, actually.
Yeah. Well, cedar is not a problem. Cedar actually creates a really high beneficial fungal compost.
Oh, really?
Yep. Elaine Ingham said that people, it's a shame that people have cedar phobia.
I thought cedar, yeah, gave off a poison or an oil or something.
It's too.
If it has
acidic.
too high in bark,
Mhm.
cedar bark is really high in oils that will kill things off. But if the amount of bark is minimal compared to the amount of actual cedar wood that's in there, bark mulch is far more dangerous than any kind of wood chips, including cedar, for microbes.
So there's a difference between bark and wood. I don't know.
Because when you think of it, the bark, the function of the bark of a tree is to prevent microbes from
That's-
penetrating in.
So that's where all the anti-bug stuff will be.
That's where all the antifungal stuff, all the antibacterial stuff, all the anti-insect stuff is all in the bark.
So I wouldn't doubt if they're actually using bark then, because that's what we tend to have available from a lot of the, like the firewood companies and all these guys with the fellow.
Yeah, if they use bark mulch,
They're just
then that
soaking it.
would be, that might be an issue.
Well, the bark is supposed to protect the tree so that it doesn't burn. So then if the bark is exposed and stripped away, then it's easier to burn. Like, the tree-
Well, and it is true that over time, the microbes will overcome the problem, because otherwise it wouldn't compost at all. Right? Over time, microbes can overwhelm the oils in the bark and consume them. It's just, it slows up the process for them. I can't understand why they would want to use cedar, straight cedar bark, because it would slow down the composting process. So when the microbial diversity is high, the plants have more balanced nutrition, and there's a greater chance that disease-eating organisms will be present. Compost ingredients, I wish they had never used this green and brown designation. It throws people off all the time. But really, probably what you should say is materials high in nitrogen, and over here,
Carbon.
materials high in carbon. Really, that's the designation, rather than green and brown. Because, if you say greens, well, right away, coffee grounds aren't green. Manure is in here.
It's brown.
And it's the color brown, but it's a green material. Like, why did people do that? Like, I don't get it.
I've seen designations of wet and dry.
That is another really important factor, and there's a reason that they actually tend to stay that way, is that these are broken down by fungi, and these are broken down by bacteria. Like and that's one way to tell. If you look at a plant that's sick, and the obvious diseased area is mushy, then it's a result of a bacterial disease. If it has spots on it, or bumps on it, or it's discolored, or something like that, then that's either fungal or viral. But bacterial diseases always cause this bacterial breakdown in general, which is what bacterial disease is just bacterial decomposition of cells. And it always results in, they both need a certain amount of moisture, but what will happen is a lot of this stuff is moist to begin with, or has a lot of moisture in it. And then when it starts breaking down through bacterial breakdown, it's even wetter. So it really collapses all the cells because there's not much carbon in the cells compared to wood and woody products. And so what happens is it starts out wet and it turns more and more and more into a mush. The more it turns into mush, the more air is excluded, and then what do we get? Anaerobic decomposition. The anaerobic guys grow and multiply in it, which are the E. coli, the salmonella, all the stuff we don't want in our compost because we don't want it on our food. So if you have exclusively bacterial breakdown, the chances that you go anaerobic are very high. And the other thing is anaerobic bacteria don't break things down as efficiently. So they don't retain the nutrients in your compost. And that's why you smell bad compost. If your compost smells bad, it's because nutrients are escaping from your compost. Sulfur, ammonia. Ammonia is full of nitrogen. Ammonia is a form of nitrogen. And so if you just put all fruit and vegetable scraps, grass clippings, bread and grains, coffee grounds, hair, fur, manure into your compost, you'll be just broken down by bacteria, and probably the wrong kinds of bacteria. So what I like to also think of this as the green material should be thought of as spark, and the carbon material should be thought of as fuel. Now, how much spark do you need compared to how much fuel if you're starting a fire? Little bit of spark and a lot of fuel, right? And so really, you just need a little bit of this and a lot of this.
If you decide that your compost has turned kind of anaerobic, can you turn that around if you add more of the
Just by
fuel?
turning your compost, you'll aerate it.
Right, so then you'll kill off the bad bacteria,
Yeah.
and then you can start populating with the good bacteria.
Yeah. And so what I suggest that people do if they want to switch their stinky compost to a healthy compost is to gather a bunch of this, these brown materials, and you can shred the paper, paper that goes through a paper shredder, newspaper, twigs, leaves. I save all the cardboard rolls from toilet paper, they're all carbon. Wood chips. Sometimes I'll buy bags of wood shavings